The Final Fantasy series has seen many different versions of the job class system. Sometimes it's seen jobs locked to a specific character, while in other games, jobs have been accessible to all party members. But regardless, jobs have become a vital part of the franchise, allowing for different tactics in battle. And even though their prominence has decreased in the offline entries, they are still very much part of the fabric of the franchise, with Final Fantasy XIV flying the flag proudly. Amongst the roster, one of the more interesting jobs available to players is the Samurai. Within this realm, Samurai have typically been characterized as skilled sword fighters and high damage dealers, as well as masters of some impressive and unique talents. They could take out foes with one-hit KOs, heal themselves during combat, or even toss coins at enemies to deal consistent damage. With roots in real-life Japanese culture, samurai are often depicted as wise, seasoned warriors with a strong sense of honor, loyalty, and self-sacrifice, and they have never been afraid to stand in the face of danger. But even though that is a good catch-all description of the job, there have been some significant and surprising evolutions throughout the years, as even though some elements have endured, many others have been introduced to help truly flesh out the job. And that's exactly what we'll be running through today, as we explore every major iteration of the job in the complete evolution of Samurai. Unlike the majority of Final Fantasy jobs, which drew their inspiration from fantasy fiction or role-playing, either in the tabletop format or video games, the Samurai has its roots in real-world history and Japanese culture. Those warriors of feudal Japan who first took up their swords during the Kamakura period have become the stuff of legend and a source of fascination throughout the globe. The name samurai first applied only to aristocratic warriors or bushi, but eventually the term was used to refer to all members of the Japanese warrior caste. Samurai were renowned for following a strict code of honor, bravery, and loyalty, which was later formalized as Bushido. As well as their sword-fighting skills and strong discipline, the samurai's traditional armor and weaponry have also become iconic. One weapon we immediately associated with samurai is the katana, a single-edged sword with a curved blade and long grip, which allowed for strong two-handed attacks. Samurai armor was also designed to be durable and elaborate, but also lightweight, consisting of many small scales and plates held together with cords of leather or silk. Their unique suit of armor was often topped by a kabuto, a helmet adorned with crests and horns, and mempo, a mask that protected the warrior's face, and often featured details such as eyebrows, moustaches, and grinning teeth and expressions designed to make the wearer appear more frightening. In place of the kabuto, samurai were sometimes depicted wearing the hachimachi, a headband of folded cloth that kept long hair and perspiration away from the warrior's eyes. Samurai also made a huge impact on popular culture, particularly in the 20th century, and have seen many representations through film, television, comic book, video games, and beyond. These media representations have helped to popularize the image of the samurai as a sword for hire, such as in the works of the Academy Award-winning filmmaker Hiroshi Inagaki. Fearless, wise, and a force to be reckoned with, it's easy to see why the samurai became an enduring figure in popular culture. So of course, it was only a matter of time before we saw the first entry in the Final Fantasy franchise. Samurai were first introduced in the series via the job system featured in Final Fantasy V, alongside over 20 different jobs. They were described in-game as master swordsmen whose keen reflexes allowed them to intercept and deflect enemy attacks. Once the Earth Crystal jobs became available, any main party member was then able to take on this role. While playing as a samurai, each of the main characters were drawn in variations of traditional armor. Even in the original pixelated graphics, we could see that each warrior was protected by solde, two large rectangular shoulder plates, and a dole, or chest plate. We also saw some variation between the characters, with some wearing helmets, either with or without masks, and others, such as Lena, opting for a headband instead. Most of the characters' samurai armor was predominantly red in color, aside from Faris, who wore blue, and Krill, who wore the slightly less orthodox choice of pink. As for in-game equipment, samurai were able to utilize a wide range of protective gear which included light and heavy armor, helmets, gauntlets, and shields. Their best equipment in most versions of the game was the Genji gear, also known as the samurai equipment, which could be stolen from Gilgamesh. And while samurai were able to use knives in battle, it made more sense, both from a technical and thematic standpoint, to arm them with a katana. This saw some pre-existing weapons such as the Murasame, Kotetsu, and Masamune reclassified as being associated with the samurai, having been associated with other jobs in previous installments. In battle, the samurai were designed to be a straightforward melee class, much like the knight, that forewent magic attacks in favour of physical damage. This was reflected in the job's high strength and stamina, which was counterbalanced with low agility and negative magic stats. However, the samurai also saw a greater focus on inflicting critical hits and killing blows, along with some other unique abilities. For example, Zenigage or Gill Toss allowed the samurai to throw coins, dealing fixed damage to all enemies. Another feature was the passive ability Shirahadori or Sword Grab, which allowed the samurai to catch and stop enemy attacks, alluding to those keen reflexes mentioned via their in-game description. Mastering the samurai job then unlocked their ultimate attack, Ianuki. This move took one turn to charge before the character flew across the screen, inflicting one-hit KOs on all enemies, and even bypassing some immunity to instant death moves. The name was most likely derived from Aiojutsu, a Japanese quick-draw sword technique that was often adopted by bushi or samurai. The attacker finished their move by resheathing the sword, and we've typically seen this move characterized in fiction with extreme, almost superhuman speed. While Inayuki failed against heavy-type enemies and most bosses, this was a swift and stylish way for the samurai to end most conventional battles. However, some of the samurai's abilities ended up working better in theory than in practice. Minauchi, or Sword Slap, was an attack that struck enemies with the dull end of the sword, a concept that paired well with the samurai's use of a one-sided blade. In theory, the attack was meant to inflict paralysis, as the opponent would be left stunned by the blow. However, due to bugs present in the earlier versions of the game, this effect failed, reducing Minauchi to what was essentially a slightly stronger physical attack. Now, as well as inspiring the job, real-world samurai also influenced the design of certain enemies. In Final Fantasy V, these included the Numblade or Slonin, a play on the word Ronin, as well as Yojimbo. While Final Fantasy V had allowed for all party members to switch between jobs, this system changed drastically with the release of Final Fantasy VI. Here, each job was assigned to a specific character, which then influenced both their design and their role within the story. Representing the samurai class was Cyan Garamond, a noble warrior from a distant land who was fiercely loyal to his lord and kingdom, and feared nothing, not even death. Appropriately for his name, Cyan's armor was predominantly blue, much like Faris in the previous game. Yoshitaka Amano's concept art also showed Cyan wearing a blue cape, though he didn't actually wear this in the game. However, Cyan was often drawn with the cape in his latter cameos and appearances in Final Fantasy spin-offs such as Record Keeper and Brave Exvius. And while he wasn't drawn wearing a traditional samurai helmet or any kind of helmet for that matter, Cyan was still able to equip helmets for protection as well as shields and heavy armor. Much like the samurai's job stats in Final Fantasy V, Cyan was heavily geared towards physical attacks, with high strength and defense and relatively low magic and speed. The low speed stat might also have pointed towards Cyan as a tactician, someone who was wise enough to think carefully about their next move, or this may have been related to his age. At 50 years old, Cyan was the oldest physical damage dealing character in the party, and we would see this reflected in his design, as his black hair tied in a ponytail was drawn with a receding hairline. Cyan was also the only playable character, apart from Strago, who was shown to have facial hair, though Cyan often opted for a neatly styled moustache in contrast to Strago's scruffier grey beard. It meant Cyan was very much an old soul, and this was reinforced not only in his appearance but also his mannerisms. He often spoke using archaic language, prompting Gao to call him Mr. Thou in the English language versions. A stickler for tradition, Cyan was also something of a technophobe, until very late in the game when he gradually began to take an interest in machinery. Often, Cyan felt he belonged in another time, which was an interesting notion considering his connection to the samurai tradition, an era long since confined to Japan's past. His music too reflected this sentiment, with the sounds of instruments commonly associated with feudal Japan. These old-fashioned values were also present in Cyan's unwavering devotion to his family and the kingdom of Doma, even after they were lost in tragic circumstances, something that led to Cyan wanting to seek revenge for an injustice. It was through these struggles that Cyan found a new purpose and his place within the party, often acting as a paternal figure towards Sabin and Gao. Cyan's primary weapon was the katana, with the strongest being the Mitsuno Kami, and equipping these allowed him to access his special ability, Bushido. With the name evoking the real-life samurai code of honor, Cyan's moveset included unblockable hits that could overcome an enemy's defenses, flowing combos of up to 4 strikes, and moves that manipulated ki energy to inflict non-elemental damage, status effects, or even allowing Cyan to absorb HP and MP from an enemy. Bushido was therefore a very versatile moveset, in which the attacks became more powerful the longer they were given to charge. Cyan could, however, equip a non-katana weapon, the Zantetsuken, which was classified as a sword. Using this, Cyan could then deliver instant death when striking. This was quite a fitting effect for Cyan, who could also learn the Bushido move Oblivion or Cleave, which had the potential to instantly destroy enemies by slicing them in two. And though the Zantetsuken became more commonly associated with the recurring character Odin, it still felt in line with Samurai Job's penchant for instant kill moves. Cyan's desperation attack, Tsubamegeyeshi, was then named after a famous technique mastered by the legendary Japanese swordsman Sasaki Kojiro. This dealt heavy magical damage to an enemy, which was unusual as Cyan's stats were more geared towards physical damage. While Final Fantasy VII largely did away with the job system, several of the game's main characters still had some strong ties to recurring jobs. In previous evolutionary studies, for example, we have noted Aerith's similarities with the White Mage, Tifa's role as a monk, and Cid's alignment with the Dragoon. At first glance, however, there might not seem to be any obvious choice for the samurai, but things change when placing the spotlight on the game's antagonist. Sephiroth's signature weapon was the Masamune, a legendary blade that only he was said to be capable of using effectively. Measuring between 6 and 8 feet long, it was clearly a distinctive and intimidating weapon. But as already highlighted, this wasn't the first time the name Masamune had appeared, as many previous games had featured the weapon, and in Final Fantasy V and VI it was specifically aligned with the samurai job. Interesting too was the sword's real-life inspiration. The Honjo Masamune, crafted by the revered swordsman Goron Nyodo Masamune, was said to be one of the finest blades ever crafted, becoming a symbol of honor and prestige as well as a national treasure. The sword has been missing since it fell into the hands of the US Army at the end of the Second World War, and to this day, its fate remains a mystery. This gives us an interesting parallel with Sephiroth's weapon. Thus far, it has not been explained how Sephiroth obtained the weapon, but we did learn that Sephiroth was hailed as a war hero after his victory in Wutai. Katana were often taken as war trophies by the Allied troops in World War II, so perhaps Sephiroth claimed the Masamune in a similar manner. There was also a notable influence from samurai swordsmen when it comes to the rivalry between Sephiroth and Cloud. In an interview with Famitsu magazine, Tetsuya Nomura stated that he'd drawn specific inspiration from the legendary showdown between Miyamoto Musashi and Sasaki Kojiro, whose Tsubamegeyeshi technique had already inspired Cyan's desperation attack. Kojiro was a known wielder of the Nodachi, a long blade that enabled powerful strikes and great reach, but required significant strength and precise techniques to use effectively, much like Sephiroth's weapon of choice. But while Kojiro was skilled, elegant, and immaculately groomed, it was the disheveled and wary Musashi who got the upper hand by using a makeshift wooden sword and taking advantage of a momentary lapse of judgment. Just like Cloud, he was also able to wield the Mitsuno Kami. It meant that while no samurai job was officially integrated into Final Fantasy VII, we could still see the influence of samurai history and culture on the characters and the narrative. Before we dive into exploring how the comprehensive blueprint provided by Cyan and Sephiroth was built upon within Final Fantasy Tactics, Did you know that we currently have over 325,000 subscribers, but that over 60% of the people who watch our videos are not subscribed? If you're not subscribed and you choose to subscribe right now, you can get us way closer to our next big milestone, hitting 350,000 subscribers. Samurai returned as a playable job in Final Fantasy Tactics. Unlocked by upgrading a unit to level 5 Monk, level 4 Knight, and level 2 Dragoon, the Samurai was reimagined as a hybrid warrior, capable of inflicting both physical and magical damage. And while they were no longer able to equip shields for protection, Samurai units made up for this by having one of the highest physical evasion attributes in the game, which helped to compensate for the unit's relatively low HP base. As with most units in Tactics, male and female Samurai had different designs, and their sprites sported different attire. Male Samurai units wore helmets, while female units wore headbands, with their hair tied up in ponytails. While their in-game sprites wore blue, a possible nod to Cyan and Faris, their concept art saw them mostly wearing red, combining armor pieces with traditional robes. Female Samurai were also drawn holding their signature katana weapons. One interesting aspect of the Samurai class was the units required to unlock it. First, we had the Monk, which already had a strong association with Samurai even outside of video games. For example, the famous Buddhist monk Takuan Soho had been the son of a samurai, and was immortalized in samurai fiction, including the epic novel Musashi and its cinematic adaptations, the Samurai Trilogy. The Knight also shared some characteristics with the Samurai class, and Cyan's job had even been listed as a Knight in some international releases of Final Fantasy VI. Finally, the Dragoon was another Earth Crystal job along with the Samurai in Final Fantasy V. Plus, the two classes were known for their powerful physical strikes, the use of two-handed weapons, and their distinctive styles of armor. Once unlocked, Samurai units gained access to Iaido techniques, a nod back to Final Fantasy V where Aijutsu was referenced, and these techniques drew spirits from the katana in the player's inventory. This introduced a spiritual element to the samurai's weapon, which was interesting considering the devotion required to craft a katana, and Shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu's philosophy that the sword was the soul of the warrior. Aidu could result in a variety of effects depending on which katana the player owned, including healing abilities, summons, and status enhancements, as well as dealing damage to enemy units. However, there was always a 1 in 8 chance that using the ability could break the katana, so they had to be used wisely. Aside from this, samurai units could also learn a useful array of reaction abilities. Bone Crusher could deal damage equivalent to the samurai's maximum HP when the unit was critically wounded. Plus, we saw the return of the Shirahadori, also known as Blade Grasp. While Tactics was fairly limited in terms of animation, the idea of a brave warrior who could strike hard while wounded or best an opponent by countering their own moves was certainly representative of the wider depiction of samurai. Final Fantasy X introduced us to Auron, the legendary guardian who brought Tidus to the world of Spira, and who guided Yuna on her pilgrimage to defeat Sin. A former warrior monk of Yevon, Auron, often referred to as Sir Auron, combined elements of the samurai and the knight into his fighting style. Similar to other samurai designs in Final Fantasy, Auron's dominant colour was red, which denoted his colour on the sphere grid, as well as his overcoat, which was made in the style of a Haori. His equipable armour was the Bracer, his main weapon was the Katana, and his celestial weapon was the Masamune. In combat, Auron typically swung his sword with his right hand while keeping his left hand tucked into his clothing as if it were in a sling, though his actions in-game showed that he was perfectly able to use both limbs if the situation required. This is believed to be a reference to Ronin, wandering samurai who had no master, which was a fitting allusion for Auron following the death of Lord Braska and his rejection from the Church of Yevon. Another detail was the jug worn on Auron's side. While the word Nog was written in Spearin script, the alcoholic drink sake has long been associated with samurai. The jug was used in 2 of Auron's Bushido overdrives, including Banishing Blade, where Auron drank from the jug and spat the liquid onto his katana. Some fans have interpreted this as a ritual to purify or feed the spirit of the blade. The jug also came into play during Auron's Tornado overdrive, where he tossed it at the whirlwind, causing it to ignite. Whatever was in that jug, it means it was certainly not for lightweights. Now, it's worth noting that there were some inconsistencies around Auron's age during development, which is why he's often depicted as being much older and more world-weary than his actual age of 35. However, his aging appearance also gives us a variation on the samurai aesthetic, still with the long, black hair, but often more dishevelled and streaked with grey. The wound on his right eye, and the way his face was often partially hidden behind his dark glasses and high collar, gave him an air of mystery, and the impression of a veteran who had already endured and survived many an ordeal. Much like Cyan, Auron too had experienced loss and trauma, and was viewed as a paternal figure within the party. He was already watching over Tidus as a promised eject, and went on to guard Yuna, the daughter of his other close friend, Braska. Both Braska and Jecht had died at the end of their pilgrimage, leaving Auron the sole survivor. Auron almost lost his own life soon afterwards when he was severely wounded by Yuna Leska, yet he then flat out refused to let his spirit pass to the far plane. Auron's grit, loyalty and sheer determination were defining aspects of his character, and his wisdom and sacrifice helped see his allies on the path to free Spira once and for all. While Auron's story officially ended with the conclusion of Final Fantasy X, his legacy then lived on in a whole host of future cameos, including Record Keeper, Brave Exvius, and War of the Vision. A version of Auron also made an appearance in the Underworld in Kingdom Hearts 2. However, Auron was not the only character associated with the samurai in Final Fantasy X, and that brings us on to the return of Yojimbo. Yojimbo, whose name translates to bodyguard, appeared as an optional Aeon who could be obtained from the Cavern of the Stolen Faith. For the first time, we also saw him accompanied by his pet dog, Durgoro, a possible reference to the film and manga series Lone Wolf and Cub, which told the adventures of a travelling Ronin and assassin for hire. When summoned, everything from his entrance, where he emerged from behind a cherry blossom tree, to his use of weapons, including his Kozuga throwing knives and his wakizashi sword, harkened back to the samurai and the Ronin. This was realised with a unique fantasy twist, with Yojimbo's enormous size and his elaborate full-body armour, which included a fanged Mempo mask, ornate golden pauldrons, and a cape. His design was rendered in colourful shades of red, purple and gold, and was topped with a jingasa, a hat typically worn by Japanese warriors when travelling or encamped. This was also something he'd worn in his earlier incarnation as an enemy character. Yojimbo also featured some unique mechanics as a summon, as he required payment in order to be recruited by Yuna. When then summoned, players were represented with the options of pay and dismiss instead of a regular moveset, and then Yojimbo attacked as he saw fit. Raising his pay and compatibility levels, which involved some complex, unseen mechanics, also hopefully encouraged him to unleash Zanmato, an instant kill move that was among the most devastating in the entire franchise. And while Giltos was more closely associated with Riku this time, Yojimbo had his own manner of converting money into damage, and this perfectly embodied the samurai as a blade for hire. Samurai then returned as a playable job in the franchise's first MMO, Final Fantasy XI. While the series had been experimenting with samurai as a hybrid class, Final Fantasy XI brought the focus firmly back to physical attacks, and, at least at first, saw the class more geared towards tanking and parrying. We also saw another radical change in this iteration, as the samurai were positioned as demon hunters, with moves such as Warding Circle and Demon Killer. Samurai was an advanced job open to players who had reached level 30 and had purchased the game's first expansion, Rise of the Zealot. If these criteria were met, the player then needed to complete the side quests started in the pirate city of Norg before waiting 3 days so that their first katana could be crafted. Now, being an MMO in which players could customize their own characters, samurai armor had some variations between different races and genders. However, their dominant colour was now black, perhaps as a reflection of their newfound role in dealing with demons. Final Fantasy XI's version of the samurai armour, as denoted by the visuals of the AF sets, were intricately detailed with gold and red adornments, and mostly covered the full body. It was perhaps the closest resemblance to real-life samurai armour we'd ever seen in the franchise, and also the first time we'd seen the horned Kabuto helmet since Final Fantasy V. But besides the look of the armour, much of the samurai's featured stats and abilities appeared more suited to a tank than a damage dealer. Fans of the game have theorised that this was how the samurai was initially conceptualised, as a tank skilled at parrying to deflect damage. However, it was extremely hard to raise the parrying skill up to a practical level. Luckily, the samurai was also a highly effective damage dealer, and they had melee abilities geared towards this role. Their special job ability, Maiko's Shisui, allowed the samurai to quickly perform at least 3 weapon skills. Meditate gave the player 100% TP almost instantaneously, and Zenshin was a passive trait that let the samurai attack again immediately if they'd missed. The fact that they were so adept at accumulating TP quickly also allowed the samurai to execute their weapon skills and skill chains frequently and with ease. However, much of the samurai's most useful gear, particularly that which was targeted towards direct damage, was fairly expensive, and this was quite the setback with what was already considered to be a rather gear-dependent class. Beyond that, Final Fantasy XI also introduced 2 samurai NPCs who went on to become recurring characters in many of the franchise's spin-offs. One was Ayame, who was the youngest and sole female recruit of the Mithril Musketeers, the elite guard of Bastok. An alter ego of Ayame was also summonable through trust magic. The other character was Tenzen, a warrior from the Far East who carried a katana known as the Phoenix Blade, which was inhabited by the Phoenix's avatar spirit. As well as appearances in spin-offs, Tenzen was even later mentioned in the lore of Final Fantasy XIV as an historic character. Final Fantasy X-2 saw a revamped version of the traditional job system, as the 3 main characters could switch between jobs mid-battle thanks to their garment grids. The Samurai Dress Sphere, which could be obtained from the Kilika Temple in Chapter 3, allowed the girls to access the Bushido skill set as well as the commands Spare Change and Zentetsu. The Samurai Dress Sphere also enabled the passive ability SOS Critical, that increased the probability of inflicting critical hits when the wearer's HP was low, a purposeful reference back to tactics. As might have been expected from X-2, the characters had a colourful, slightly more feminine twist on their traditional samurai garb. Their clothing looked rather lightweight in comparison to other versions of the samurai armour, which may explain the Dress Sphere's low HP, but it appeared to be better geared towards mobility, which saw relatively high evasion and agility, contrary to some of the earlier adaptations of the job. As well as unlocking the Bushido skill set, which shared the name of Auron's overdrive abilities in Final Fantasy X, Yuna and Riku's samurai gear both featured symbolic tributes to their former friend and ally. Yuna's katana was the Spider's Kiss, while Riku wielded the War Blade, both of which had originally been part of Auron's weapon set. Pain, however, who never knew Auron and thus had no real connection to him, was the only one to use a unique samurai sword. However, Pain had her own special affinity with the samurai class, perhaps due to being a warrior by default, as her learnt Bushido abilities were unlocked whenever she wore the mascot dress sphere. Another nod to a samurai-themed character from Final Fantasy X was seen in Yuna's version of the trainer dress sphere. Her animal companion, Kogoro, was modelled on Yojimbo's dog Daigoro. The name too was a reference to the prefix ko, which means small in Japanese, while dai translates to great, indicating that this was not merely another asset reuse, of which, admittedly, there were many in X-2. The original release of Final Fantasy XII largely did away with the job system in favour of the license board, where any character could equip any weapon and learn any ability, provided they had the correct license. However, a revised version of the game's leveling system was introduced in the International Zodiac job system, which was later re-implemented in the Zodiac Age. This version saw 12 different versions of the license board created, each one corresponding to a sign of the Zodiac and themed around a particular job. The Aquarius board was known internationally as Bushi and enabled access to weapons such as the Murasama and the Masamune, and skills usually associated with the samurai class such as Guild Toss. The decision to name the class Bushi, as opposed to the better known term samurai, can be linked back to a similar naming convention in the Japanese version. Hiroyuki Ito, the game's director, had chosen in the Japanese version to go to Mononofu, which was a more obscure and ancient term associated with samurai warriors, and Bushi. His reason for doing so was to give Final Fantasy players something to discover should they decide to look up the word in the dictionary. And as this wide mantra was applied to many aspects of the International Zodiac job system, it may also have been an objective for the Western localization team, encouraging players who were unfamiliar with the term Bushi to look it up. Final Fantasy XIV followed a similar process to Final Fantasy XI, offering an initial array of jobs before then supplementing the roster via subsequent expansions, and it was within the Stormblood expansion that the Samurai job was featured. Confirmed to be a melee DPS job from their announcement, the Samurai design was quite different and arguably much more focused than it had been back in Final Fantasy XI. And to further this, the Samurai's inclusion also inspired locations and plot lines for this expansion, as well as several new Samurai-themed NPCs. The Samurai job was available to players who owned the Stormblood expansion after they reached level 50 as either a discipline of war or magic, and had completed the Way of the Samurai quest. And once unlocked, players found that the role of Samurai was to find ways to engage foes up close, as they were capable of dealing massive damage single-handedly. But the downside was that Samurai were a good deal more fragile this time around, and so this was something players needed to be very mindful of. Aesthetics-wise, the designs seen in the Samurai's concept art and appearances in the Stormblood trailer harkened back to some of the earlier designs in Final Fantasy. Red on black was certainly the dominant colour scheme, often with flourishes of gold and blue, giving us a visually striking look at the job. One popular promotional image depicted a samurai wearing a jingasa, sandals, and the Myochin armour, and brandishing a katana. We also saw characters sporting the red Hiyori, which felt reminiscent of Auron in Final Fantasy X. Samurai in Final Fantasy XIV had access to a huge range of katana, by far the biggest number of designs in any Final Fantasy game to date, and each sword had its own unique scabbard. Being a disciple of war, most of the samurai's equipment fell under armour for striking and accessories of slaying, the same categories as the monk, which continued the close relationship between the two jobs. Pivotal to unleashing the samurai's full potential though were the Sen, Genki, and Meditation gauges. After learning the move Gecko, the Sen gauge could be used to execute the samurai's Aijutsu weapon skills. Unlocking another two skills, Kashi and Yukikaze, then allowed players to master Sen's three forces, Setsu meaning snow, Getsu meaning moon, and Ka meaning flower. In a departure from its appearance in the earlier games, the move Maiko Shishui allowed samurai to use the last weapon skill of a combo without actually executing the full combo, and thus not fully depleting the Sen gauge. Likewise, the Genki gauge could be used to perform Hisatsu attacks, and the Shoha attack could be unleashed when the player had accumulated 3 stacks on the Meditation gauge. In short, timing was of the essence when playing as a samurai, and knowing just the right moment to unleash their stored energy was key to their success. As in Final Fantasy XI, Final Fantasy XIV then introduced several new samurai-themed NPCs, some of whom became recurring characters in the franchise, and most were involved in the events that centered around the Far East region of Doma. One prominent figure was the main antagonist of the Stormblood expansion, Xenos Galvus. As the viceroy of the conquered imperial territory of Doma, Xenos was ruthless and brutal, and had taken a liking to samurai swords. His 3 weapons of choice were all katana, which went by the names of the Storm, the Swell, and Amino Habakiri. Being a pureblood Garlean, Xenos also possessed a third eye, which was the name given to an ability associated with the samurai job. On the other side were the Doma Liberation Front, led by Hien Raijin, heir to the throne of Doma, and whose members included the peerless samurai warrior Gosetsu Daito. It's worth noting that this plotline was heavily inspired by Cyan's backstory in Final Fantasy VI. In both games, a kingdom called Doma was home to a proud samurai tradition before the royal family were killed by invading forces. In Final Fantasy XIV, the last king of Doma was named Cyan, a name derived from the original Japanese name given to Cyan, and Prince Hien was believed to allude to Cyan's son, Owain. While these are not the same people, and these events did not take place within the same world, it's still fascinating to see these stories, locations, and characters were reimagined decades later. The third installment of the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy, Lightning Returns, then introduced a unique job system based around schemata. These were effectively customizable classes centered around costumes known as garbs, which Lightning could switch between quickly during combat, serving as an evolution of the dress sphere mechanic in X-2. The base game had numerous garbs available, but through downloadable content, players were able to access 7 samurai-themed garbs known as the Samurai Collection. This number was most likely a reference to The Seven Samurai, a classic war movie by Akira Kurosawa, who also directed the 1961 film Yojimbo. Lightning's samurai garbs included Shining Prince, Art of War, Utsusemi, Sohei Savior, Dark Samurai Shogun, and the Flower of Battle. Each garb included the auto ability Critical Regen, which helped keep Lightning in the fray for longer after she'd already taken on a considerable amount of damage. Self-healing abilities had already been seen with the job before, plus the concept of a warrior who could call on their inner strength and continue fighting while at death's door was evocative of the legendary discipline and courage of the samurai. Lightning's large array of samurai garbs also allowed her to juggle a variety of weapons and abilities, with some of them featuring different types of level 2 elemental magic. And being a style icon as well as a fearless warrior, Lightning's samurai garbs were also an impressive sight to behold, as her outfits were all highly detailed, colourful, and customizable. After Lightning Returns, the samurai then reappeared in numerous games. In Final Fantasy Explorers, for example, they wore quintessential garments and had access to Zanshin and Ai. The former was able to reduce cooldowns, while the latter increased elemental affinity, and when charged, increased the probability of a critical hit. In Record Keeper, characters like Cyan and Auron, as mentioned, were classified as samurai, and they were available alongside the standard job, which was a derivative of the original incarnation seen in Final Fantasy V. It meant that by the time Final Fantasy XV launched, there had been quite a few varied approaches for the samurai, with numerous NPCs introduced that adopted various traits, and this was how the samurai manifested here. Similar to the likes of Cyan and Auron, Core Leonis was a character who was much more experienced than the main party of protagonists. Having sworn allegiance to King Regis from a young age, Core became known as the kingdom's greatest sword fighter, wielding a katana to great effect. Such was his skill that Core was appointed as Regis's main protector, but he was still overconfident and reckless. That was until he challenged the legendary Gilgamesh and was humbled, with Gilgamesh keeping Core's Genji blade as a trophy. As time passed, Core could only watch as Insomnia fell and the kingdom who he'd sworn allegiance to was slain. But as if to parallel Auron, Core was then tasked with aiding and guiding his former master's progeny, Noctis, as he sought to defeat Arden Azunia and put an end to the Star Scourge. Beyond this, Final Fantasy XV also saw a comprehensive iteration of Yojimbo. Following his memorable stint as Yuna's most expensive Aeon, Yojimbo had appeared as a recruitable unit in the likes of Tactics S and as a fire elemental in Dimensions 2. He'd even sort of appeared in Final Fantasy XIV, however this was eventually revealed to be Gilgamesh in disguise. In Final Fantasy XV, we saw Yojimbo making something of a return to his roots as an enemy character clothed in traditional Japanese attire. However, his concept also integrated various features from his most famous appearance. Standing over 9 feet tall according to the in-game data, Yojimbo retained his colossal presence from Final Fantasy X. There also seemed to be another connection to Spira in his attire, as the long sleeves of his kimono, along with his new colour palette of pink, white, yellow and purple, were reminiscent of Yuna's summoner clothing. Yojimbo's demon design also retained his signature katana, jingasa and sandals, and we saw long black hair worn in a ponytail, which hadn't been seen since his appearance in Final Fantasy V. Appearing in some late-game dungeons, as well as a much stronger version in the hunt A Fistful of Gil, Yojimbo was a demon with a pretty nasty range of attacks. Up close, it could charge its katana, then force it into the ground, causing spikes of dark elemental energy to rise from its surroundings. At greater distances, Yojimbo could perform Gil Toss by throwing coins from a pouch on his belt. Yojimbo was also capable of Ice Strike insta-kill moves, and in a slightly unusual move for a samurai-themed character, also wielded ice elemental attacks that can inflict the Frozen status. Final Fantasy XV also featured another humanoid enemy with a samurai-themed design known as the Ronin. While this demon also fought with a katana and wore a kimono and sandals with its long hair tied up, the Ronin was much darker in its colour and relied upon physical damage and dark elemental attacks that could cause instant death. War of the Visions Final Fantasy Brave Exvius saw a whole host of new features and characters added to the Samurai job class. As a main job, those who adopted Samurai were given access to damage-dealing moves such as Hien, Kongu, and Oborozi. They could also use meditation to raise the bravery of their allies, which was one of the few instances where we saw a samurai giving buffs to their companions, plus they could use Hayate to move to another panel. The samurai's passive abilities varied slightly between characters, but most had access to some form of counterattack, along with Third Eye, which allowed the unit to raise their evasion for 3 turns, and Blade Soul, which raised the unit's attack and evasion rate while lowering their defense. As a sub-job, the samurai's abilities included Devotion, which raised their attack and critical rate, Night Veil, which dealt damage and can inflict blind on enemies, and Illusion, which raised their allies' evasion rates. Again, providing buffs for allies was not something we'd often seen in terms of the samurai job, as their buffing and healing abilities tended to concentrate on themselves, allowing them to continue battling, even if this meant going solo. While these moves offered some variety on the samurai job, so did the characters associated with it. However, they also managed to harken back to many of the common traits and archetypes we'd seen throughout the series. Samurai was the default job for a few different characters such as Rob and Seymour. One of the 4 warring lords, and known as the brave and wise king, Rob carried on the regal and paternal elements we'd seen with the samurai characters, such as the royal family of Doma from the Stormblood expansion of Final Fantasy XIV, and the wise and fatherly roles played by Cyan and Auron. But while Rob continued these legacy traits, his aesthetic was quite distinctive in terms of the samurai-themed characters. Hailing from the west, Rob's blonde hair and blue eyes were unusual, as was his long flowing beard. The other 2 characters, however, were exceptionally skilled swordsmen from the Far East who acted as mentors to some of the other playable characters, namely Stern Leonis and Miranda and Ravies, who were being trained in the ways of the samurai. So Owe, known as the Seeker of Blade Souls, even became a very popular character within the game, ranking at number 17 in the global server's character popularity poll. His name was also quite similar to Owain, the name of Cyan's son. Seymour, whose sub-jobs were Viking and Thief, possessed an interesting weapon called the Adachi of Destruction. Considered to be a great demon sword, the katana was said to have taken a liking to Seymour, and after fighting together for a long time, the evil within the sword eventually vanished. This may relate to tactics, where the katana were also imbued with spirits. One thing that united Owe and Seymour was their love of alcohol, as detailed in the vision card description Sword Refinement. As with Auron, this may well be a nod to the samurai tradition and ritual embellishment of sake, or maybe they were just enjoying themselves. Other characters who were associated with the samurai included Varush, a blade soul who fought using a katana, and Laswell, a knight of the Grand Sheld, who had samurai as a sub-job. The flexibility of the job system in War of the Visions, though, allowed for some greater exploration of the samurai class and how these traits were realised in the wider range of diverse characters. Curiously though, even though Auron did appear in the game, he was not classified as a samurai in terms of either his main job or sub-jobs. That brings us on to the most recent evolution of the samurai job class, and it comes from 2012's action RPG Stranger of Paradise: Final Fantasy Origin. This was a dark fantasy reimagining of the original Final Fantasy and had an innovative take on the job system. As such, Jack could switch between jobs during battle, and advanced and expert jobs could be unlocked by earning points and leveling up certain job trees. In Stranger of Paradise, Samurai was an advanced job that was unlocked by leveling up a new basic job called Ronin. Like the Samurai, the Ronin job also fought with katanas, plus they were able to use the command Aigiri, which unleashed a swift, slashing attack after returning the sword to its sheath. Aside from losing Aigiri, the Samurai was definitely a worthy upgrade on the Ronin. The advanced job unlocked new abilities such as Maikyo Shisui and Zanshin, which gave the Samurai an edge in MP management, allowing them to execute powerful attacks at just the right moment. With enough parrying skills to deflect damage, the Samurai was a formidable physical fighter capable of unleashing some deadly katana combos. One unusual addition to the Samurai's arsenal came via the release of the Different Future DLC. This enabled the Samurai to fight using guns, which was an unexpected choice given their traditional history and theming up until this point. Nonetheless, this was definitely a unique twist on the job. As was fitting with the tone and aesthetic of Stranger of Paradise, the Samurai's armour came in shades of black and red. The armour was also highly elaborate, featuring plenty of gold detail, and many components inspired by real-life samurai gear, including a horned kabuto helmet and a snarling mempo mask. Overall, Drac as a samurai was definitely not someone you'd want to cross a katana with on a dark night. It meant Stranger of Paradise adopted a faithful but also progressive take on the samurai, and that's quite an interesting point, as even though there have been many notable samurai introduced over the years, and there are common traits, the job has been through a significant evolution. What started out as a pure physical damage dealing class has seen dips into spirituality, elemental affinities, and through Stranger of Paradise, even long range attacks. There have also been solid narrative themes present whenever named samurai have appeared, with them often showcased as older, wiser heads who are there to nurture and guide the next generation through their lived experience. But as we've now reached the conclusion of this study, we'd like to ask you to tell us about who your favourite samurai has been and in which games you've enjoyed using the job the most. If you found this video insightful, we'd also very much appreciate any interactions you can give in terms of liking the video, commenting, and sharing it around to people who you think might enjoy watching it. Alright everyone, with that, this is Darryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, CloudClone28, The Livestream, and Zukin TDK, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.